The golden throne trembled, as if something buried beneath the crust of terror had exhaled for the first time since the galaxy learned to fear the dark. A vibration so low it became the pulse of a dead star stirring. The custodians stationed around the sanctum felt it through their armor before they heard it. A seismic growl that crawled up the pillars of the Eternity Gate and slithered across the vaults of the Sanctum Imperialis, rattling reliquaries and ossified saints alike. For 10,000 years, those tremors had been the whispered terror of prophets and the mad hope of zealots. Yet none had ever been as absolute, as deliberate, as the one that now rippled through the throne dais like the cracking of fate. The Emperor's fingers twitched first, tiny spasms of golden bone wrapped in the pale suggestion of desiccated flesh. But those nearest recoiled as if a cosmic predator had moved in a cage that was never meant to hold it. Tubes burst from calcified connectors. Feeding conduits screamed as divine biology rejected its bondage, and the cybernetic lattice that had sustained a corpse god shrieked under the strain of life forcing its way back into matter. Light, not the incandescent burn of plasma, nor the witchfire of sorcerers, but a cold, perfect luminance, like the memory of creation, radiated from within the Emperor's form, peeling away the brittle layers of death. His spine arched, vertebrae cracking like thunder, wings of invisible pressure fanning outward and slamming every armored warrior to their knees. The backup systems of the throne surged in desperation, machine spirits howling, but they were insects pushing against a rising sun. He rose. He rose without effort, without sound, without the slightest acknowledgement of the impossible weight of millennia. The cables that once bound him charred to ash, and the throne itself whined as if mourning the end of its purpose. A breath escaped his lips, not the hiss of lungs reawakened, but the quiet collapse of an era. Across the galaxy, psychers fell screaming as a psychic shockwave erupted, sweeping through the warp like a nova of intention, ripping illusions, puncturing the lies of demons, extinguishing half-formed nightmares, and bending the tides of unreality around a single awakened will. On the Indomitus flagship, Robute Gilliman staggered mid-stride, Ceramite groaning as the Primarch clutched his own skull, feeling the unmistakable imprint of the mind he once thought forever lost to agony and machinery. The Emperor's voice, more concept than sound, passed through him with the finality of judgment. Return. In the deep shadows where the lion prowled between half-real worlds and the broken remnants of the fallen, the same summons struck him like a burning sword to the spine, dragging him from centuries of self-imposed twilight. His breath caught. His hand tightened around the hilt of the blade that had been his sole companion, and without speaking a word, he turned toward Terra, compelled by the pull of blood older than stars. On the throne world itself, alarms blared through the palace as the psychic surge ruptured sensors and toppled astropathic choirs into unconsciousness. Adepts chanted catechisms in panic, half in awe, half in terror, as the custodian guard encircled the dais with weapons raised and hearts disbelieving. The Emperor stood beneath the fractured halo of ancient machinery,
not as the rotting deity they worshipped in trembling ignorance, but as a reconstructed being of sinew, light, and absolute purpose. His body was monumental, sculpted not by gene forges, but by the memory of humanity's golden dream, each movement radiating the contained violence of a supernova. His eyes opened, revealing irises that were not colour, but verdict, perceiving every atom, every lie, every prayer that had calcified into dogma during his millennia of imprisonment. A single thought pushed outward from him,
silent, yet echoing through the warp, with such clarity that even the gods recoiled. The Incarnate Era begins. But in that same instant, another presence stirred. Not a whisper, not a ripple. A roar. A bellow of such raw, unrefined hatred that the warp itself boiled in answer. In the brass citadel, where rivers of blood cascaded in tides that never cooled, Khorne lifted his horned head and snarled. The return of the Emperor was not merely an affront, it was a threat to the very concept of war. And so the blood god answered in the only language he possessed, by pointing one colossal, gauntleted finger toward the void and unleashing his favoured butcher. Kharn the Betrayer felt the order before it was spoken, his veins igniting with the molten approval of his god, his armour drinking in the roar of endless slaughter. Around him, the warbands of the Red Howl stirred, engines of demon-forged vessels screaming to life, their hulls vomiting chains, spikes, and glyphs that bled. The horde followed him with mindless fervour, because they knew this rage. They worshipped it. They drowned in it. Terror's doom hurtled toward the Sol system on rivers of crimson warp fire. The Emperor turned his head slightly, as if listening to a distant drumbeat only he could hear, and for a moment the ghost of war reflected in his gaze. Not fear, but recognition. The cosmos braced as the father of mankind stepped forward from the ruins of his throne, his footsteps heavy with 10 millennia of pent fury and patient judgment, and began descending the shattered dais, each stride echoing through the palace as the first storm of the new age gathered above Terra. The first step the Emperor took beyond the dais sent a resonance through the marble arteries of the Imperial palace, a bass note so profound that custodians felt their secondary hearts falter before recovering under sheer discipline. His presence no longer diffused in stagnant radiance like an artifact plugged into a decaying throne. Now it cut through space with predatory exactitude, a gravity of sentience so intense that reality bent inward as if afraid to offend him. Every breath he drew seemed to reorder the air, each molecule aligning to ancient memory, as though Terra itself strained to remember the scent of a living god. Servitors collapsed without understanding why. Priests fell to their faces, muttering litanies that turned to incoherent sobs as their minds broke against the contradiction of divinity walking where only a corpse idol should have remained. The Emperor did not acknowledge them. He walked as one reacquainting himself with the weight of a body, the subtleties of bones and sinew, the old familiar burn of purpose reshaping every contour of form. His awareness stretched far beyond the walls, past oceans of spires across the void, threading through the warp itself like a blade drawing a fault line through madness. To his sons,
that call grew clearer. On the Indomitus flagship, Guilliman's thoughts churned in disciplined violence. Logic warred with awe as he stared at the macro hollow of terror flickering with static from the psychic shockwave. He felt the Emperor's will like a tidal pressure behind his sternum, overriding every Imperial calculation, every concern about fleet disposition or sector-wide logistics. He whispered a command, and the entirety of Battle Group Primus shifted course without question. The void parted as the fleet surged towards Sol. Guilliman closed his eyes at last, allowing himself a single, razor-thin instant of emotion. Father, what have you become? What have we become in your absence? Yet the question dissolved beneath the weight of necessity. Duty remained a blade he had carried since Calth, and it guided him now. In the deep-shadowed labyrinth between real space and the echoing remnants of Caliban's curse, Lion L. Johnson strode through the ruins of a forgotten watchtower, cloak of night trailing in broken geometry behind him.
The Emperor's summons struck not as command, but as revelation. Peeling back layers of resolve the Lion had forged around his own guilt. The gnawing solitude, the centuries of hunting nightmares among the fallen, all of it abruptly contextualized beneath the impossible truth. He is awake. The Lion's gauntleted fist tightened. Without hesitation, he turned to the phantoms of his lingering nights, shades of oaths he still carried, and whispered to no one, "I return." He mounted his voidcraft, a predatory shard of obsidian camouflaged against the shifting dark, and it vanished into a bleeding slit in space. Terror loomed, and terror braced. As the Emperor exited the Sanctum Imperialis, battalions scrambled to form honor lines, but their formations broke the instant his gaze passed over them, not out of fear, though fear clung to every soul, but because the truth of him negated the need for ritual. He was no longer an idea chained to golden myth. He was manifest, and the warp felt it. In the outer solar reaches, the first vessels of the Red Howl burst from the Imperium like blades ripping through skin. They came in tides, crimson juggernauts, demon engines howling, hulls draped with chains dripping effervescent gore that evaporated into warp smoke. The assault was not a siege. It was a declaration of butchery. Khan's flagship, the Gore Fury, led the charge, its prow shaped like a snarling, horned skull that gnawed at the void with burning fangs. Inside, Khan paced the command deck with restless brutality, each step denting corrupted steel as world-eaters chanted invocations to Khorne. The betrayer felt the Emperor's awakening not as light, but as insult, a cold defiance that dared diminish the supremacy of slaughter. He laughed, hoarse, violent, ecstatic. "Blood waits," he growled, teeth bared with feral devotion. "And terror bleeds first." The Red Howl fleet accelerated, ripping past the defensive outposts of Sol with contemptuous ease. The Adeptus Mechanicus shrieked alarms across Mars. Titan mustered its grey knights. The Phalanx redirected course. But the speed, the rabid focus of the assault threatened to outpace defensive coordination. In the palace, the Emperor halted at a balcony overlooking the wounded sky of terror. The clouds boiled with residual warp static, and lightning flickered in unnatural patterns like script written by unseen claws.
He inhaled once, and the sky trembled. A lattice of golden filaments unfurled from him, invisible to mortal eyes, but felt across the ether like the tightening of a bowstring. His voice, this time audible, a low, inexorable murmur, rolled through the chamber of penitence behind him, through the air, through the warp. Enough! The word did not command, it corrected. Warp tides shivered as though forced to recall an ancient shape they had long forsaken. Demons howled in confused agony. But though the Emperor's authority spread like dawn across oblivion, the red howl did not slow. Khorne's blessing surged through Kharn, swelling his already monstrous strength, burning away any influence short of direct annihilation. The blood god's wrath manifested in a crimson corona around the fleet, repelling the Emperor's correction with raw, belligerent defiance. The Emperor exhaled, and his face, newly restored, sculpted by truth rather than worship, hardened. Very well. He turned from the balcony. Let them come. Deep beneath the palace, tectonic groans vibrated through chambers older than humanity's recorded memory, as void shields reconfigured and macro defences locked into firing arcs. Skies ignited as defence lasers charged and orbital plates reoriented with mechanical precision. Terror awakened its arsenal. But even that would not be enough if his sons did not arrive in time. Behind the Emperor, a custodian captain approached, helm bowed. Lord, what are your orders? The Emperor did not look back. Prepare for war, he said,
and the air thrummed with the unspoken continuation. And prepare for revelation. For the first time in 10 millennia, he walked toward battle not as an icon, not as a father reclaiming a wounded realm. And beyond the moons of Jupiter, the red howl tore into the inner system, the roar of Khorne echoing with murderous promise as terror steeled itself for the second siege. The first of Mars' outer picket ships died without broadcasting a single cry, split neatly in half by a demon blade the size of a cathedral. A weapon manifested from the prow of a Red Howl warship as it tore its way into real space, trailing ribbons of screaming warp matter. The shockwave of its arrival rattled the orbital docks, sending servitors tumbling like discarded toys as the alarms of the red planet keened in mechanical panic. In the ash-red skies of the forges, towers of iron bellowed smoke as their machine spirits awakened to the scent of impending carnage. Yet even their ancient ire was dwarfed by the tide that followed. The Red Howl emerged in a formation more akin to a stampede than a fleet. Hundreds of demon engines chained together by blood-forged sigils, their hulls pulsing with arterial light. Star destroyers sharpened into blades. Colossal wrecks reanimated by the insane will of Khorne. At their centre, the Gore Fury surged forward like an enraged predator, its hull warping between material and immaterial states, each fluctuation peeling screaming faces across its surface. Within its command sanctum, Kharn planted the butcher's nails deeper into his skull,
accelerating the frenzied thrum inside his mind until it became a symphony of slaughter. His every breath came out as steam, fogging the gore-smeared lenses of his helm. Around him, the World-Eaters roared in exultation, beating their armoured fists against their chests, the rhythm a thunderous heartbeat of violence that reverberated through the deck plates. "Terror ahead," growled a helmsman, though the words were mostly swallowed by the hungry rumble of the ship. Karn lifted Gorechild, the chain axe sputtering with bloodfire, and spoke with a clarity that cut through madness like a razor. "We carve a path through the craven shell of their cradle. We drown their false hope. We tear the heart from the corpse's empire." The nails sang, Khorne's laughter boomed, and the red howl accelerated. On Terra, the Emperor stood in an ancient hall whose marble floors bore the scars of the heresy itself. The air was charged with ozone and memory, and his silhouette shimmered as though existence struggled to fully resolve his form. His senses stretched across light years, through battlefields still unfolding in future seconds, perceiving trajectories of loss and threads of victory long before the first shots of the new siege had even been fired. He felt Guilliman carving through real space with relentless purpose. He felt the lion slipping through shadow lanes with the precision of a predator closing upon prey. Yet he felt, most clearly, the hatred of Khorne moving toward him like a red star collapsing under its own fury. He whispered, not aloud, but into the marrow of reality, "I am coming for you as well." His stride carried him into the Hall of Arcane Might, where vault ceilings arced like petrified waves frozen just before collapse. Custodians followed at a respectful distance, not by duty alone, but because proximity to the Emperor now was like standing beside the event horizon of a psychic singularity. Even their gene-wrought courage quivered beneath the weight of his presence. A senior custodian, a giant among giants, dared to speak. "Lord, the Red Howl will breach Mars' defensive ring in minutes. They will reach Terra shortly after." "They will reach me," the Emperor corrected softly, though the softness was deceptive, a calm that preceded celestial devastation. "Let them." Thunder rattled the palace as his words reverberated through the bones of the world. The Emperor raised his hand, and light coiled around his palm, not radiant, not holy, simply true. Truth made manifest, burning away distortion. The same light danced across the warp-born wounds left in the palace walls by the throne's millennia-long corruption, stitching reality back together, stitch by invisible stitch. Outside, thunderheads of unnatural crimson formed as the first orbital plates engaged. Massive guns the size of city blocks pivoted toward the incoming storm. Across the moon titan, grey knights enacted rituals older than their order, binding their wills into a bulwark against demonic intrusion. But they all knew this was prelude. The storm carried a name, and he was already breaking through. The Red Howl's vanguard ships ripped into the inner system like shrapnel flung from a dying god. One crashed into the orbit of Luna, its demon engines screeching as it collided with a defense platform.
The explosion was a blossom of warp fire that unfurled into a screaming mouth, biting into nearby stations before it dissipated. Then the gore fury emerged behind it, smashing through debris with contemptuous ease, shedding molten shards that briefly became living serpents before winking out into vacuum. Khan stood at the prow observation gantry, the glass before him cracked and stained with the blood of those who previously stood in his place. Terror grew larger in his vision, its wounded skies now burning with the glow of activation sigils as the planetary defense grid roared awake. The betrayer felt the Emperor's presence again, a cold, calm force that opposed everything he was. His rage intensified, nails screaming for release. "Father of lies!" Khan roared into the void, voice amplified by warp resonance until planet-side Vox stations crackled with the echo. "I come for your head." And the Emperor, still walking steadily through the palace, answered without moving his lips, "Then come." The response struck Khan so suddenly that even he paused, momentarily stunned by the certainty, the unflinching simplicity of it. His snarl widened. Then the second siege of terror began. Defense lasers lit the void in blinding green lances, slicing through demon engines, vaporizing lesser warships. Battleships of the Imperial Navy surged forward, their broadsides vomiting plasma and macro shells into the tide. But for each vessel they destroyed, 2 more clawed out of the warp, propelled by Korm's wrath. The void became a slaughterhouse of flame and metal. Mars's orbital citadels opened fire with sun-hot beams, carving glowing scars across the Red Howl's flank. Yet Khan's fleet pressed on, unstoppable, unreasoned, a force of pure aggression defying attrition. The gore fury plunged into the gap torn by its brethren, charging toward the blue-white glow of Terror's void shield. Khan raised Gorechild above his head, and the ship's prow ignited with warp flame as Khorne poured his strength into his chosen butcher. The shield shuddered. Then it broke. Terror's skies screamed, and deep within the palace, the Emperor finally halted, the scent of ozone and ancient stone mingling as he turned toward the Eternity Gate. His eyes, burning with the weight of 1,000 futures, narrowed. The butcher was coming, and the father of mankind stepped forward to meet him. The moment the void shield collapsed, Terror groaned like a wounded titan. Atmospheric ions howled, spiraling into vortices of bleeding light as the shockwave hammered down upon the upper atmosphere. Fire fell in sheets, forming incandescent veils that rippled over the continents. Vox networks crackled, overloaded by the psychic shriek of demons tasting the world's exposed flesh. And for a heartbeat, the entire planet seemed to inhale in collective dread, as though even its stones feared what would come next. Through the burning breach descended the Red Howl. Their dropships were not vessels, but iron coffins wrapped in chains, burning sigils carved into their hulls with the names of 1,000 slain worlds. They streaked down like incandescent meteors, trailing the cries of their bound demons, their exhaust plumes blackening the clouds into shapes that resembled scream skulls. Some exploded mid-entry, tearing themselves apart in frenzied eagerness as their demons broke free prematurely, only to be devoured by the upper atmosphere defences. Most survived, and one descended faster than all others. The Gore Fury's spear of assault, carrying Khan, the betrayer, himself. Terra's defensive batteries roared in unison, macro cannons belching storms of adamantine shells, laser lancers searing the sky into a scarlet lattice. Entire mountain ranges flickered under the barrage. The void became a thunderous machine of death. But the Red Howl did not slow. They accelerated, not out of strategy, but out of lunatic devotion to their god. Khan stood at the edge of the drop bay, one hand grasping an infernal chain for balance, the other stroking Gorechild with a tenderness utterly at odds with the butcher he was. His breath fogged around him in dense plumes, the nails raking his skull with maddening rhythm, each pulse a spike of euphoric violence. Voyage alarms blared as the dropcraft became a fireball, tearing through Terra's upper atmosphere. Khan ignored them. His gaze pierced the inferno ahead, seeing not continents nor cities, but a single point of absolute challenge: the Sanctum Imperialis. "Let it fall," he growled. "Let me fall with it." The chain snapped. Not malfunction, not accident. Khorne's gift. The dropcraft disintegrated around him, shedding plates and decks in flaming spirals, and Khan launched himself directly into freefall, a blazing red meteor hurtling through the chaotic fury of Terra's sky. Below, the Imperial Palace thundered with the roar of mobilization. Titans of the Legio Ignatum rose from their hallowed vaults, shaking dust from their crimson armour, their war horns bellowing ancient wrath. The Adeptus Custodes formed glistening shield walls across the plaza, their auramite armour gleaming in the flicker of the burning heavens, each one a demigod awaiting the fury descending toward them. Skitari regiments flooded firing platforms, chanting binaric hymns as they locked their weapons on the falling red star. Lasfire, autoshells, missiles, plasma, all rose to meet Khan in a storm of incandescent fury. It did not matter. The blood god denied physics, denied attrition, denied reality. Bolter rounds vaporized before they reached him. Missiles spiraled away, their machine spirits screaming in warped agony. A Titan's plasma blast intersected his trajectory, yet instead of vaporizing him, it simply parted, forming a burning tunnel through which the betrayer plunged. He landed. The shockwave flattened entire battalions. Custodians staggered, even their monumental frames driven back. The ground cracked open, a crater forming beneath him as fire curled upward in serpentine tongues. Khan rose from the centre of his impact, armour glowing white-hot, Gorechild revving in anticipation so fierce it sounded like a carnivore drooling. He looked upon the palace defenders, thousands of elite troops prepared to give their lives. Yet, in his eyes, they were grains of sand between him and the single truth of violence he sought. "Out of my way!" he charged, a living avalanche of carnage. Custodian shields met him first, their golden surfaces flashing with kinetic barriers. Kharn crashed into them, and where other foes would have been slowed, the betrayer accelerated. Gorechild biting through auramite, through gene-wrought bone, through souls. Heads flew. Blood sprayed in arcs that boiled before hitting the ground. The custodians fought like legends, halberds flashing with lethal grace, but every motion was swallowed by the hurricane of rage that was Kharn. He carved a path deeper into the palace defences, laughter bubbling from his throat, not joyful, but ecstatic, a priest revelling in his right. The palace shook, not from Kharn's rampage, but from footsteps, heavy, measured, irreversible. The Emperor walked. The Eternity Gate opened as if bowing, its golden doors groaning in reverence and terror. He emerged, draped not in cloth nor regalia, but in reality, bent to form around him like a cloak woven from the laws of creation. His face was carved from absolute calm. His gaze was a verdict cast before the crime. The defenders felt him before they saw him, a tidal shift in gravity, an inhalation of truth so sharp it cut the air. Calm froze mid-swing. Gorechild, half buried in the chest of a custodian he had nearly split in two. His helm turned. The nails screamed. His heart thundered, and a single emotion struck him like a hammer. Recognition. The Emperor descended the steps, each footfall ringing like the tolling of a world's final judgment. His voice carried not through sound, but through certainty. Kharn, you are the echo of a lie. The betrayer roared, tearing Gorechild free in a spray of steaming blood. I am war! The Emperor lifted no weapon. He raised no fist. He merely looked at Kharn, fully, deeply, entirely. And the world changed. Reality dimmed at the edges. The sky flickered. The air thickened, as if the concept of movement itself was questioning its validity under his gaze. Kharn charged, Gorechild screaming. The Emperor did not step back. He did not block. He extended a hand toward Kharn, not to strike, not to halt, but to reach into the truth of him. The chain axe halted inches from his palm, not by force, but because the idea of striking him ceased to be coherent. Kharn convulsed, the nails jamming, shrieking in static agony. His vision blurred into fractals of blood and memory. You are not war, the Emperor said, voice now audible, resonating through flesh and metal. You are an interpretation, a distortion, a word Khorne imposed upon your existence. Kharn snarled, but it was weaker, uncertain. I am the blood gods. You are a slave to a definition. The Emperor stepped closer. Every inch he moved peeled layers off Kharn's identity. And definitions can be rewritten. Gorechild fell from Kharn's hands. The axe screamed like a dying beast. The betrayer dropped to his knees, vomiting blood and warp ichor as the Emperor pressed his palm to Kharn's brow. Not a blow, a correction, a revelation.
War is not rage, the Emperor whispered. War is cost. Khan screamed as his essence buckled. The blood god roared from across the warp, the brass throne shaking as Khorne surged in desperate fury. Rivers of blood reversed their flow. Axes shattered, demons clawed at their own skulls. The Emperor closed his fingers. Khan's existence shattered like a glass idol struck by truth. And Khorne bled. The warp convulsed. For the first time in eternity, the blood god staggered. Back on Terra, silence fell. Custodians stared in stunned disbelief. The Emperor lowered his hand, expression unreadable, and spoke with quiet finality. This is the end of your era of lies. But above Terra, in the bleeding seams of the warp, 3 other gods screamed. Nurgle, Tzeentch,
Slaanesh, driven not by unity, but by terror. And in their panic, they did the unthinkable. They fused. A newborn abomination formed in the Imperium, the Chimera, heaving its first monstrous breath. And the Emperor turned his gaze toward the warp itself, as if staring into the face of an ancient debt. The final confrontation had only begun. The warp itself recoiled as the Chimera opened its many eyes. Some were lidless maws. Others were pupils shaped like fractal spirals collapsing inward. Others were nothing but pits of negative space leaking screams. Its form refused coherence. At times, a bloated mass of Nurgle's fecund decay, dripping continents of rot. At times, a lattice of impossible geometries twisting with Tzeentch's deceit. At times, a sinuous, pallid seduction echoing with Slaanesh's hungers. Flesh became feather, became crystal, became liquid, became void. Its roar tore open star paths and crushed them again between breaths. It was born from fear. The fear of a truth too sharp, too bright, too real for entities that fed on illusion. As the warp convulsed around its birth, demons shriveled into nothing, their forms unable to survive the shockwave of a new principle imposing itself upon unreality. The Chimera rose, each of its 3 fused throats voicing a different, discordant purpose. Disease, change, excess, twisting together into a single anthem of survival at any cost. And its first impulse was to kill the one who had wounded their kindred. On Terra, the Emperor felt it rise, felt the warp distort, knot, coil like a serpent preparing to strike at the material universe itself. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the palace dimmed, not from darkness, but from the overwhelming presence of decision. When he opened them again, there was no hesitation. He lifted his hand, and the air tore open, forming a gate of pure will. No machinery, no ritual, just his mind cleaving a passage through the veil. Reality bent backward like a curtain forced aside. The custodians instinctively stepped back, their discipline faltering before the gravity of the act. The Emperor turned slightly, and his voice, so calm it was terrifying, echoed through every molecule of the sanctum. My sons will arrive soon, but the warp waits for no throne, no battlement, no protocol. This must be answered now. A shadow fell across the hall. The lion stepped through a side archway before guards could even announce him, having traversed half the palace in silence, his presence like a blade sheathed in solemnity. His armor was dull, scarred, yet his eyes burned with a clarity that had evaded him for centuries. He dropped to one knee. Father. Soon after, as if chasing his own heartbeat across space, Guilliman descended from a teleport flare, armor still glowing with residual warp burn from his direct plunge into the Sol transit corridors. He too knelt, though his movement held the rigidity of a strategist already calculating consequences. My liege, my father, give us our task. The Emperor regarded them both, two shards of his original dream, tempered by millennia of failure and endurance. You will follow me, he said simply. Into the wound. Guilliman hesitated only a fraction of a heartbeat. Into the warp. The Emperor did not answer with words. The gate widened. The warp roared beyond it, its tides bowing away from him in instinctual terror, like a storm recoiling from the sun. The lion rose first. Then let us finish what was begun on the day the galaxy betrayed itself. Guilliman followed, breath steady, though his eyes betrayed the weight of what awaited. Reason and will, the Emperor said, touching each son's shoulder with a gesture that transcended blessing. These are the weapons we wield. Not faith, not fury. Truth. With a final step, he led them into the sea of madness. The warp screamed. Their entry was a violation, an intrusion of coherence into a realm that thrived on contradiction. Reality clung to the Emperor's form like a dying man clutching hope, creating a halo of scarred order around him. The lion moved like a shadow given intention, his presence fracturing illusions before they fully formed. Guilliman followed in practiced formation, the logic of his mind projecting a stabilizing grid across the molten unreality. The Chimera sensed them instantly. It turned its titanic, shifting mass, and its three voices merged into a singular shriek that rippled through the corridors of the Imperium. Disease clouds blackened the crimson sky. Rivers of possibility twisted into hands reaching to unmake them. Songs of luscious despair flooded the void. The Emperor did not slow. This union is a tantrum, he said, his voice reverberating through the warp. A child screaming to postpone consequence. The Chimera hurled the first strike, a deluge of entropy vomiting from 1,000 maws. Nurgle's rot, magnified beyond contamination, not meant to infect, but to erase the concept of purity. The Emperor raised his hand. Concept met counter-concept. Decay met truth. Where rot touched the Emperor's presence, it evaporated into harmless steam, like lies burning in the presence of a witness who cannot be deceived. The second strike came instantly. Tzeentch's sorcery. Spirals of impossible logic and paradox folded into spears of potentiality. They struck the lion first, their fractal tips singing with malevolent intent, seeking to rewrite him into something else. A traitor again, a ghost of Caliban.
The lion's snarl cut through the spell, and he swung his blade not through matter, but through narrative. The story the warp tried to impose shattered, its fragments dissolving into screaming colours. The third strike followed. Slaanesh's caress, seductive and annihilating, a wave of emotion so intense it threatened to drown Guilliman in visions of perfection, victory, reverence, absolution for every sin he carried. Guilliman stepped forward, exhaling slowly.
"I have no use," he said, "for fantasies." His hand closed, and the illusions burst like glass under pressure. The chimera recoiled, its mass flickering through shapes, cathedral-sized limbs, serpents of silver, decayed wings, fractal talons, each iteration more unstable than the last. The Emperor stepped closer. "You fear what I have become." The chimera bellowed, its sound a tidal wave of agony. "You break the order. You break the feast. You break the rules of the game." "There are no rules but those you impose upon slaves," the Emperor replied. "And I am not your subject." The chimera lunged. A storm of realities collided. 3 warp gods' fury in one strike. But the Emperor did not parry. He unmade the premise of the attack. His eyes blazed with a light not divine, not mystical, simply real. "Your power is borrowed," he said. "Your form is fear. Your existence is a negotiation among parasites." His voice lowered, deadly. "I will not debate with you." The chimera faltered. Its forms destabilized, truths clashing with lies within its core. The lion struck its flank with a blow that cleaved through thousands of overlapping illusions. Guilliman attacked its other side, driving logic like a spear into its contradictions. And at the centre of all of it, the Emperor placed his hand upon the creature's malformed heart. "Be what you are," he commanded, "and nothing more." Truth detonated. The warp convulsed so violently that entire demon worlds cracked apart, collapsing into silent void. The chimera screamed as its fused gods tore away from each other, unable to maintain unity under the weight of reality. Nurgle dissolved first, his rot turning to harmless dust. Slaanesh imploded into a single note of longing that faded into silence. Tzeentch twisted, flailing in 1,000 directions before unravelling into threads of probability that dissipated like smoke. The chimera ceased. The warp exhaled. The Emperor lowered his hand. "It is done." The lion bowed his head, breath steady but strained. Guilliman stood straighter, his armour flickering with stress fractures from the conceptual battle. "What becomes of chaos now?" Guilliman asked. The Emperor turned toward the distant, pulsing heart of the warp, the throne of Khorne trembling, the other gods retreating into feeble recovery. "Chaos remains," he answered, "but weakened, afraid." He extended his hand toward Terra. The gate reopened. "Come, a new age waits." And the 3 returned to the material universe, victorious, changed, and followed by silence where 3 gods once screamed. Terra awaited its living emperor. The Incarnate Era
was about to begin.
The return to real space struck terror like the first true dawn in 10,000 years. The warp gate collapsed behind the Emperor and his sons with a thunderous implosion, sending a ripple across the palace that extinguished every lingering trace of demonic residue clinging to its ancient stones. The air cleared. The skies brightened. The very gravity felt corrected, as if the world had shifted back into alignment with a truth long buried beneath eons of superstition and desperation. The Emperor stepped onto the marble of the sanctum once more, and the stone, carved from the bones of Terra's first mountains, seemed almost to sigh under his weight, as though grateful to bear a living god again. The lion emerged behind him, cloak torn by warp winds, armor scored with fractures that pulsed faintly where unreality had bitten him. His gaze swept the hall with predatory calm, but beneath that calm simmered something new. Clarity, perhaps even absolution. Guilliman arrived last, armor crackling with the fading embers of the conceptual battle, each scorch marking a reminder of the logics he had bent to withstand the Chimera's assault. His stride was steady, but his eyes were heavy with a realization he had not yet named. The custodians, what remained of those who had survived the siege, knelt in somber reverence, not out of ritual, but because their bodies refused to do anything else before the being who had slain a fusion of gods with nothing but truth. The Emperor breathed in the air of terror, a living breath, not the labored hiss of a corpse bound by machinery. Weapons powered down, flames guttered out. The palace held its silence as if it feared breaking the fragile moment where past and future touched. And then he walked. Not back into the throne hall, not toward the shattered dais of the golden throne. He walked past it, past the cradle of 10 millennia of stagnation and worship, past the machine that had consumed countless souls to keep a dead god flickering. Guilliman watched with widening understanding. "You intend to—" "Yes." The Emperor stopped before the throne. For a long moment no one moved. The golden throne towered like the carcass of an ancient titan, its frame cracked, its conduits burnt out, its psychic scaffolding trembling from the violent ripping away of its prisoner. It stank of centuries of decay, sorcery, sacrifice. But it was empty now. Emptied of its occupant, emptied of its purpose. The Emperor placed his hand upon the armrest. The entire device shivered, machine spirits howling in dread as they felt the verdict approaching. "This was a mistake," he said softly. A whisper, yet it vibrated through the palace like a fault line snapping. "A prison built from necessity, sustained by fear, worshipped as if it were destiny." His grip tightened, barely. Metal screamed. Gold cracked. A lattice of fractures spiderwebbed across the ancient frame. But humanity does not need a god bound to a throne. He pulled, not with rage, but with intention, and the golden throne broke. It came apart with a sound like an empire exhaling its last breath. Metal bending, sacred machinery shattering, psychic wards collapsing into glittering dust. The dais crumbled beneath the weight of 10,000 years. The custodians bowed their heads. Some wept, though they did not know why. Others trembled as the weight of old dogma dissolved into air. Guilliman stepped forward,
voice trembling despite all discipline. "Father, without the throne, the Astronomicon will burn from me," the Emperor said, turning his gaze upon his son. "I have no need of chains to guide my species." Guilliman nodded slowly, the enormity of the transition dawning. "Then the galaxy will see you, feel you, directly. They already do." He moved to the shattered balcony above the Sanctum Imperialis, the same one from which he once watched a galaxy rise and fall in his absence. Now he stepped into open air.
The sky, once choked by warp storms and ash, peeled open into blue. True blue. Colour returning to a world that had forgotten what uncorrupted light looked like. Citizens across Terra gasped as the clouds rolled back, revealing a sun no longer smothered by the scars of the rift. Pilgrims fell to their knees. Soldiers dropped their weapons. Tech priests tore out their litany scribers, unable to reconcile omens with reality. The Emperor stood at the balcony's edge. His presence radiated outward, not holy, not mystical, but profoundly real. A force of mind and flesh intertwined, unbound, neither corpse nor omnipotent myth. A being incarnate. The psychic signal washed across Terra, across Sol, across every ship in orbit and every mind attuned to the Imperium. It was not command. It was not threat. It was clarity. "People of Terra," he said, his words rolling across the world like the tolling of a colossal bell. "The age of worship ends." A silence followed, massive, trembling, expectant. "The age of becoming begins." The lion bowed, his shadow stretching long across the marble. Guilliman knelt, tension melting from his form as if ancient burdens had been lifted. Far away in the warp, weakened chaos gods withdrew, licking their wounds, whispering among themselves in panicked anticipation. For they felt it, felt the new shape forming, a truth dangerous not because it was divine, but because it was undeniable. The Emperor looked upon his world, his sons, his species. The Incarnate Era is born, and Terra, holy, broken, reborn, roared its answer into the heavens. The roar of terror rolled across continents like a tide reclaiming land long drowned beneath darkness. A human sound, raw, trembling, alive, echoing against the adamantine walls of the palace and rising into the newly cleared heavens. It was not adoration, not blind worship. It was recognition. The acknowledgement of a father returned from the dead, weight of myth, to stand among his children as something neither distant nor untouchable, but terrible and tangible. A being who chose flesh over divinity and consequence over eternity. The Emperor's gaze swept outward, and every soul who felt it knew with a certainty deeper than instinct, that the galaxy had entered a threshold from which there would be no return. Behind him, Guilliman rose slowly, the air around him shimmering with the aftershock of the new order taking shape in his mind. Duty reoriented itself, shedding centuries of theological scaffolding, recalibrating to a future now anchored in presence rather than memory. The lion took a step forward, silent as a shadow,
his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, not out of readiness for battle, but as if grounding himself in the solidity of purpose regained. The Emperor turned from the balcony. "There is work to be done." His voice resonated through the marble, through the bones of every warrior still kneeling. Terra will adapt. Humanity will learn. The galaxy will resist. A flicker of something passed across his expression. Not doubt, but an awareness of the enormity of what must follow, as if even his vast mind needed to pass the cascade of consequences that now unfurled. "Guilliman," he said. The Primarch straightened, exhaling a breath that trembled only slightly. "Father, you will dismantle the bureaucratic rot that has fed upon my absence. Burn it cleanly. Reforge governance from function, not superstition." Guilliman nodded. It was not an order he welcomed, it was a burden he accepted. "As you will." The Emperor's gaze shifted to the lion. "You will take the shadows that once consumed you and turn them outward. The fallen, the traitors, the remnants of chaos, hunt them, not as ghosts from your past, but as threats to humanity's future." The lion bowed his head. No words were needed. Outside the broken hall, aircraft howled overhead,
their engines adjusting to new flight patterns as the last debris of the siege fell in smouldering arcs across the horizon. Vox channels flickered with half-panicked, half-exultant reports. Chaos forces in retreat, demonic manifestations dissipating, warp storms collapsing like dying stars. The Emperor strode from the balcony toward the lower halls, and the lion and Guilliman followed like twin gravities orbiting a greater mass. Servitors attempted to approach with ritual data scrolls, but their limbs shook violently as machine spirits cowered. The Emperor needed no scripture, no litany, no intermediaries. As he descended a shattered staircase, the palace opened into a massive courtyard where the survivors of Terra's defense had gathered in unsteady formations. Custodians, Sisters of Silence, Guardsmen, Skitari, Mechanicus adepts, all united by exhaustion, awe, and the scent of smouldering ruin. Their armour bore rents from demon claws. Their banners were torn and blackened. Blood, human and monstrous, stained the stones. When the Emperor entered the courtyard, every being dropped to one knee except the Silent Sisters, who simply bowed their heads as if acknowledging a truth they had always sensed, but never witnessed. The Emperor paused before them. For a moment, he allowed his gaze to wander across the faces of those who had bled and died for him, even while believing him long dead. He did not offer gratitude. Gratitude was too small, too fragile a word. Instead, he offered acknowledgement, and that alone made warriors weep. "Rise," he commanded. They rose, though some swayed, their bodies too broken to fully obey. Yet they rose. The Emperor raised his hand and a wave of sensation, warm, precise, impossibly gentle, passed over the courtyard. Wounds closed. Broken bones aligned. Minds shattered by warp exposure found clarity. He did not heal them fully. He gave them strength enough to stand. Healing without cost was not truth. And truth was the foundation of the Incarnate Era. A custodian approached, helm under his arm, face pale with awe. "Lord, The Mechanicus wishes to preserve the fragments of the Golden Throne. They call it a sacred relic, a symbol of—
No!
The Emperor's voice silenced the courtyard.
Let it be dismantled, melted, reforged into tools that serve the living, not the dead. Tech priests trembled, mechadendrites curling in distress. The Emperor's gaze flicked toward them, not unkindly, but unyielding. You will adapt your doctrines. Your worship of machinery ends. Your reverence must be for knowledge, not myth. One tech priest, braver or more broken than the others, attempted a protest. But Omnis, sire, you are— I am not your god. The Emperor's words cut across the courtyard with surgical sharpness. I never was. The priest fell silent, collapsing to his knees, overwhelmed not by anger, but by disorientation, by the dizzying gravity of a worldview collapsing. Gilliman watched this with a tight jaw. Father, he said quietly, you will break them. The Emperor looked at him, not dismissively, but knowingly. They must break, he replied, to become what humanity needs. The lion stepped closer. A galaxy in turmoil will not wait for them to adapt. A galaxy in turmoil, the Emperor said, will find me waiting. He raised his hand toward the heavens. The clouds parted. The sun struck his form directly, casting no shadow, as if even light refused to obscure him. And then, beyond terror, beyond soul, the warp itself responded. Not with storms, not with screams, but with a shuddering recoil. Across 1,000 worlds, demons dissolved mid-manifestation. Rituals sputtered and died. Sorcerers lost control of their spells as the fabric of warp energy trembled at the presence now anchoring humanity. The Imperium did not gain a god. It gained something far more dangerous to chaos. A reality principle wearing mortal flesh. The Emperor lowered his hand.
Gather the High Lords, he said to Gilliman. Gather your sons, he said to the lion. Gather your courage, he said to humanity. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from the core of terror itself, we begin. The Incarnate Era moved from proclamation to motion. The summons of the Emperor rippled through the Imperial palace like a seismic command encoded in the marrow of every being who heard it. Custodians sprinted through corridors carved with 10 millennia of dust and ossified ceremony. Administratum adepts scrambled with trembling quills and mechadendrites sparking in panic. The surviving High Lords, ashen, wounded, their robes torn from the earlier chaos, gathered in the Helios confluence, the grand chamber where policy had calcified into scripture over centuries of stagnation. Now it felt like a tomb waiting to be broken open. The Emperor entered without herald. There was no need. Reality announced him. The air shifted, gravimeters whined. Candle flames bent toward him, like all things subconsciously orienting toward the anchor of existence newly embodied in flesh. The High Lords fell to their knees. Not one remained standing, not the Lord Commander Militant, not the fabricated general's proxy, not the ecclesiarch with his trembling censer spilling incense in a trembling cloud. Some whispered litanies, others wept openly. A few stared upward, trapped between awe and terror.
The Emperor looked at them with the cool impartiality of a judge reading a ledger of crimes. Guilliman stood at his right side, the lion at his left, two titanic silhouettes bracketing a force of nature. "Rise," the Emperor said. The command carried no anger, yet it struck like judgment rendered. They rose, some unsteadily. The ecclesiarch's lips quivered with 1,000 prayers, but no words would leave him. The Emperor turned his gaze toward him first. The man flinched so violently he nearly collapsed again. "Your temples," the Emperor said, each syllable weighed with truth,
"will be repurposed." The ecclesiarch swallowed, voice cracking. "Repurposed, my lord?" "Into centres of learning," the Emperor replied. "Into sanctuaries of science. Into halls where humanity studies the universe rather than begs it for miracles."
A shocked murmur spread through the chamber. The master of the administratum choked. The inquisitorial representative stiffened as if bracing for annihilation. The Emperor continued, his tone unchanging, merciless only in accuracy. "Faith will no longer be currency. Only action. Only understanding." The ecclesiarch trembled, unable to reconcile centuries of doctrine with the presence of the being who now rejected them. Guilliman stepped forward, his voice controlled but edged with exhaustion. "Father speaks truth. The Imperium has strangled itself beneath dogma. We must rebuild it as a civilization, not a cult." The fabricator general's proxy raised a shaking mechadendrite. "My lord, if doctrine falls, the Mechanicus—" "Will adapt," the Emperor said, "or collapse. Their survival is their choice." The proxy bowed, mechadendrites curling like wounded serpents. The Emperor moved past the High Lords towards the hololithic map of the Imperium that flickered above the central dais. A fractured galaxy of burn scars, warp fissures, orphaned sectors and dying stars. With a gesture, the entire projection steadied, realigned, brightened. His mere presence clarified the data, banishing centuries of static and myth. "The Great Rift weakens," he observed. "It will close." Guilliman inhaled sharply. The lion's expression barely shifted, but a flicker of fierce hope broke across him like moonlight crossing an ancient blade. "Humanity stands at the edge of a precipice," the Emperor said, "but no longer alone, no longer blind." He turned towards his sons again. "You will rebuild the Imperium from purpose, not memory." Guilliman bowed. "I will unify the bureaucracy and rewrite its foundations." The lion placed a hand over his heart.
"And I will hunt the darkness that writhes beneath its edges." The Emperor nodded once, approval implicit. Then his gaze shifted upward, as though perceiving shadowy limbs clawing at the edges of reality. "Chaos will react," he whispered. "Broken, desperate. But they will react." "Let them," the lion murmured, hand resting on his sword. "We will be ready," Guilliman added. But the Emperor shook his head. "Not yet." His eyes grew distant, seeing through terror, through soul, through the void, into a future not yet written but already trembling beneath the weight of his choice. "Before war returns,
before the galaxy shifts into its new shape. I must speak to humanity. Guilliman blinked. To all of them? Yes. The High Lords looked at each other in fear. My lord, one began, the astropaths. No intermediaries, the Emperor said. No distortion, no misinterpretation. He stepped into the centre of the chamber, and the marble beneath his feet glowed faintly, as though resonance itself struggled to contain him. The Astronomicon still burns within me. I will turn it outward. Guilliman stiffened. Father, the psychic cost is mine to bear. The room dimmed. Shadows lengthened. Light behind the Emperor intensified, not radiance, but presence, bending reality as it tried and failed to encompass him. Brace yourselves, he warned. He closed his eyes, and the galaxy screamed. Across 1,000 worlds, every astropath convulsed. Every unsanctioned psyker fell to their knees. Every city, every ship, every battlefield paused mid-motion as a wave of consciousness washed over the Imperium. Not painful, not blinding, but overwhelming in its clarity. It was not speech. It was understanding. I am alive. I have returned. You are no longer abandoned. Rise, humanity. Rise and become what you were meant to be. Miners dropped their tools and sobbed in relief. Soldiers collapsed against ruined barricades, laughing or weeping or staring at the sky in disbelief.
Children in hive-tier slums felt warmth for the first time in their lives and did not know why. Entire continents prayed, not out of fear, but because they finally understood their prayers were no longer needed. And in the warp, the Chaos Gods recoiled in agony. The Emperor opened his eyes. The psychic wave subsided. Silence flooded the chamber. Guilliman, breathless, shaken, whispered, "Father, the galaxy heard you." "Yes," the Emperor replied softly. "Now we rebuild it." But even as he spoke, the lion's hand tightened on his sword. A shadow passed over his expression. "Father," he said quietly, "someone is coming." The Emperor did not turn. "I know." Guilliman looked between them, brow furrowing. "Who?" The Emperor finally faced his sons. His gaze deep, ancient and unreadable. A son who did not answer my call. The chamber darkened. The air thickened. And far across the stars, something stirred. The Incarnate Era had begun, but its first trial was already on its way.